listeners, it's Melanie and Abby back with episode 2 of our podcast series. In our last podcast, in honor of Mental Health Awareness Month in May, we talked a little bit about our goals for the series. We broke down some terminology, and we redefined vulnerability and how it ties into reevaluating the way we live our lives and how we can practice self-care. And do you want to talk about what we might cover in this, what we are going to cover in this episode?
Yeah, so we're definitely going to cover, so we're going to practice, engage more with vulnerability. So Melanie will spend time talking about her experiences with anxiety. I'll pitch in maybe a little bit about social anxiety, but I'll focus mainly on addressing some symptoms of depression. We'll talk about some of the basic science, nothing too complicated. We're not in-depth researchers, no PhDs here, but, from what we could glean from basic research, we'll talk about that. But before we get into the main bulk of it, before Melanie give her the mic, I want to start with a quote from Elizabeth Velasquez, who is an amazing YA author, who gave a quote during one of the readings at our university, which is that truth is the softest place where you get to hold yourself and allow yourself the gift of vulnerability. And I think that's something very important for us to think about as we are sharing our experiences, not only for all of you to maybe be encouraged to share yours or to listen to others, but for ourselves as well, because there's something very cathartic about being able to share what it's like going through anxiety or going through depression.
So we thought we'd start out with kind of talking about what anxiety and social anxiety and depression looks like, what the general conceptions are, misconceptions, and obviously, disclaimer, again, it varies from person to person. What Abby experiences is very different from what I experience. And so we can only really talk about, what we deal with on a day-to-day. So please keep that in mind.
We do provide, we will provide screenshots of general symptoms from the National Institute of Mental Health, so a reputable website so that you can see the general symptoms, but then, we'll talk about individual experiences as well.
Yep. And so some of the common symptoms of generalized anxiety disorder, I'm sure many of you are probably already familiar with, is feeling restless, fatigue, difficulty concentrating, irritability, headaches, stomach aches, muscle aches, difficulty controlling feelings of worry, sleep problems. Some of the symptoms of panic attacks are having an increased heart rate, sweating, trembling, chest pain, feelings of impending doom, feeling of being out of control, and alongside of anxiety a lot of times is depression. But I kind of wanted to talk about my own personal experience and what anxiety looks like for me, because it looks a lot like these general symptoms, but it's also can be very particular. And so growing up, I never really had a vocabulary for what I was experiencing. And even now, I find it difficult to authentically express myself, which I think is made clear when I'm words. And on a general sense, I'd have anxiety if there's a certain person who's in close proximity to me, or fear of saying the slightest thing to kind of tick somebody off or make them feel upset or angry. I remember in high school, I used to sleep next to my grandmother sometimes, and I would literally be like this and too afraid to move, and I could not sleep at all because any sort of movement that might disturb her, I didn't want to wake her. And I would just be racked with anxiety. And it came to a point where I knew, I didn't need to feel that way, but it happened anyway. And I think that's, the inherent issue about anxiety is, you can have the logic, you can understand that you don't have to react the way that you do, but it happens. And for me, it also involves, micromanaging facial expressions, and I've had a lot of people tell me I have RBF, and I'll feel my face muscles twitch. I don't know if you ever feel that.
I get it. I get it when we take pictures. So if we take pictures and they're smile, my lips are all over the place twitching. So things like that definitely resonate in terms of You know, sometimes when you say things, I'm like, feels like a lot of social anxiety too, of that fear placed around others judging and not knowing what people are thinking, but thinking they're thinking the worst.
Right. It's exhausting.
Yeah.
It's so exhausting. And so most of the time I would resort to silence because that's like the safe, you know, if you don't say anything, you can't hurt anyone. And I think there's this general conception of like what anxiety looks like, and it's just like full on panic attack and very visceral. But sometimes for me, it's just very subdued. And like this whole world would be collapsing inside of my brain and no one would have the slightest idea. And I remember in middle school, I had a friend who, for the longest time, would avoid me. And she told me one day, she was like, you know, you're actually pretty cool, but I always thought you were a bitch. And and I just was like, how? I feel like I'm like the nicest person ever, you know? I was the big...
Because I'm so scared of being mean.
Exactly. Like... And she was like, you just always look so angry. And I'm like, I'm actually just really, really anxious.
Or scared.
And
or
scared.
Worried.
And it translates into major RBF.
But she didn't see that. No one sees that. You know, that this thing of, you know, what can stress you out. But I think it's also cool. Not cool, but it's also, I always say that, but it's interesting and important to realize that, you know, panic attacks are things that resemble, it can be very visible or not, but that, you know, they don't always necessarily happen as a result of what's actually in the immediate area. That you could have had a panic attack about what said. Did you say the name?
I don't remember.
The person A. Person A. No one say anything. What happens in the mental health podcast stays in the mental health podcast. But this unknown person who said that, that it could have you could have reacted to it much later. Like I had anxiety about, you know, a speech I had to give in a class, and I was stressing about what people would say to me, and I had a panic attack hours before, even in a group therapy session. Very embarrassing in the moment, but probably one of the safest places to have it happen. But it was far in the future. But I was freaking out, having a full-blown panic attack as if I was already in the moment.
Right.
So it's like, you know, someone having a panic attack doesn't always mean it's something in the immediate area. It often can be, but it's important to know that it could happen at any moment. There's not like a special time that it has to happen.
Right. And I recognize that because it's not always a visceral, very visual thing, that people don't recognize what's going on, which makes it harder for people to say, hey, are you okay? Like, can I help you with something? And like for me, not being able to vocalize that or share that kind of, and having these panic attacks behind closed doors kind of led to feelings of like inadequacy and not having that language. I just thought, I'm just a really nervous person. This is who I am. I'm not normal, there's
something wrong with me.
There's something wrong with me.
Because no one else seems to be going through this, you know? Because then people probably hide it the same way if they are, and that kind of stuff. So it doesn't help. It makes the problem feel more isolating.
Exactly. So, and the funny, again, not funny, not cool. I
mean, we could talk, like, just address that we say things like this as a way to kind of diminish, is this feeling of, like, I feel like both Melanie and I are, like, you know, we're not trying to be like, yeah, woe is us. We're just like, yeah, it's like, haha. But, like, in our heads, we're like, no, it's not. It's terrible. But this kind of, like, coping and defense mechanisms to ascribe language that makes it feel more lighthearted. When in reality, we have experienced it. We know we want to reemphasize that it's not an enjoyable thing. It's just here right now, as a way of engaging with the material. We've used sometimes, you know, perhaps awkward laughing or, you know, awkward terminology to help kind of gauge the way we understand it.
That was so eloquent.
Was it?
What she said. Yes. What I was going to say was I love to perform. I love being on stage. I love singing for people and acting and performing, which I think most people would find almost ironic, considering I have anxiety.
That it shouldn't match, and they were like, you don't have anxiety because you can do these things.
But here's the thing, it's like in the very beginning, I was going to say career. When I, singing in talent shows in middle school and high school or at weddings, like I would get so nervous, my external limbs would kind of like come in, and
Mm-hmm.
my heart rate would race. And these are very normal kind of
Reactions.
right.
Yeah.
But there's a point where, like, I didn't know how to differentiate between what was normal, like just normal stage fright, and what is,
debilitating anxiety.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And so it took me years until I was able to recognize that, oh, these are symptoms of what were just kind of normal stage fright symptoms and what is actually like more crippling than that. And I mean, the first time I shared that experience and my feelings around anxiety, I was 26.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a long time to like not have the dialogue for these things. And so for me, like I feel like I'm rambling, but I think the thing I wanted to touch upon was like when I fall into those panic attacks, and it's so silly to think that I didn't recognize these things because they're so big.
Mm-hmm.
Like I would start with the stomach ache, and then my chest would start to get tight, feel like it was being pulled in by a black hole. Had trouble breathing, my heart rate would increase, my palms would get sweaty, and if it would get to, a further stage, it would potentially escalate to like hyperventilation, I'd start crying, feeling of the world crashing, and I literally felt like I was dying. And I was just like, something's wrong with me. I don't know what it is.
Mm-hmm.
But it took me, I think, just until recently to realize I'm having a panic attack.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what happens. And these are some things that I can kind of explore to mitigate that.
So I can expand on, kind of using the anecdote of you performing. I'm the exact opposite, where, even though I've received a lot of support and, therapy measures and things like that,
Mm-hmm.
that the thought of being on a stage is absolutely terrifying. But it's one of those things, we can talk later in later episodes about medication, but, kinds of, the physical symptoms that come with anxiety, that even if it's not a panic attack, that, you can still go through the sweaty palms, the shaking, the locking up. And I think, something my own therapist, talked to me about was that we often have this idea that people with anxiety respond with like the fight or flight response.
Mm-hmm.
In general, that if something is uncomfortable, people either, go against it or they flee. But then the common one people don't think about is, my therapist said, the fight, flight, or freeze. That people freeze when they're in a situation that is so high tense and so panicky for them that they're like, I'm just going to freeze. I'm going to lock up because that's the safest thing my body thinks it can do right now.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's kind of, we said, where you kind of just draw into yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And that if I make myself small, and that's very common for me going through social anxiety, that if I can make myself smaller, less people notice me, because a lot of it is the fear of what other people are thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And, and that my therapist always said that, like, people are selfish, that we think people care about us, like, and, our problems more than,
Mm-hmm.
but if we're all thinking that everyone's worrying of what this person thinks of me, they're not thinking of the other person. That kind of thing, that we kind of spotlight affect ourselves in a bit. We catastrophize, we mind read, we think, things are worse than they are, doesn't mean we shouldn't trust sometimes our gut. Sometimes anxiety is there in a way that's
Mm-hmm.
protective, that your
Mm-hmm.
body tells you, hey, this is not okay.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of stuff. But when it becomes debilitating, when you can't do the things you want to do, you want to enjoy, you can't sing, you can't perform, I can't, have workshops with other people, I can't speak up to give my opinions on things because I'm worried people are going to think I'm dumb.
Mm-hmm.
That's the point where suddenly the anxiety is not functioning in the way of keeping someone safe. It prevents you from doing something that you would like to do. So I think a lot of the general symptoms you talked about for social anxiety, for a generalized anxiety disorder, fits social anxiety disorder of, the physical symptoms. But, a lot of the tie for social anxiety is that it's always connected to, other people, social situations. Anytime there's some type of expectation for performance maybe, or for, cognition, or like, how coherent are you, how are people going to perceive you, things like
Right.
that, versus, not just lying in bed worrying that something bad is going to happen. That's a very
Mm-hmm.
different experience that I've never quite had.
And the more you talk about social anxiety and how it involves other people, the more I'm starting to think about, because this story that I was going to share.
Give us the brief version of
The
it.
brief version. So every Wednesday, I had a workshop, part of my MFA, at 3 p.m. 3:30, and I would take the bus to school. So every Wednesday, to no fail, at noon, it wouldn't even register to me, today's Wednesday, we have that class necessarily. My stomach would start to hurt. And then I lose my appetite, and I'm like, I can't eat. Okay, what's happening? And then the closer it got to 3 o'clock, when I had to walk towards the bus, I would have all of those symptoms, those side effects of the panic attack. And then I'd get to class, and I have not eaten anything because I couldn't. My hands are shaking, and my heart rate's increased. And I mean, I won't go into the structure of the class, but it was the structure and being in that environment that kind of like induced that anxiety, and knowing that I have 2 minutes. I'm timed to say something smart that someone hasn't already said already. And after the class would end, I'd be left with like the worst headache. And I realized it's like it's probably the chemical imbalance. I'm having all this anxiety, and then my body's coming down and it's crashing. And that would happen every single Wednesday for that whole semester at noon. And it's just wild to think that like my body is just wired to have that reaction before I can even register what's happening.
Yeah, and I could definitely talk more about like the actual like balancing the physical and the mental in a later episode. You know, when we talk about medication, the idea, because I used beta blockers, so the idea of just the physical, how can we control it? You know, if your body reacts, even if, as you said, you knew strategies, but like your body still does things anyway.
Right.
So we can talk about that later, but you know, we can maybe move into things like, you know, going through all these things, you know, feeling like you can't engage in the class. You know, you come out of that class tired, and you're like, you know, what did I gain? Because the whole time I was freaking out.
Right.
Even after I shared, I was still like, I couldn't engage with the class material because suddenly that's what the whole thing was about, was did I do good enough? And I don't think I did. Me being worried that like, am I going to give the speech well, or did I not give it well? And then did I actually learn things like that affect the way we function on a day-to-day basis. And I think, you know, we were talking a bit when planning this of, you know, how do you handle, you know, anxiety, and then especially if depressive episodes come along, or, you know, chronic depression, how do you handle that? Things like that. So we can move into, you know, the kind of chicken and egg, you know, we're talking about anxiety, but then depression can often come hand in hand with them. So, you know, I can talk about, you know, symptoms of depression, kind of the way Melanie did with general, and then go into my experience with it. So for symptoms of depression, you know, once again, general ones, that these symptoms can be experienced over a prolonged period or very occasional episodes. So some general ones are that there's a persistent feeling of sadness. You know, they include anxiousness there on the National Institute of Mental Health. This idea of a flatline kind of mood, feelings of hopelessness, being irritable, feeling like you're worthless, or that you're not able to help yourself, you're out of control. You may lose interest or pleasure in things you might have enjoyed doing before or could enjoy doing. You're fatigued, you talk maybe more slowly. You might feel restless, might have trouble concentrating. We're seeing a lot of overlap, too, with some of these symptoms with anxiety. And so often with diagnoses, you know, reference back to episode 1, these things can often be confused for each other. So, you know, sometimes that's why it can be helpful to be able to talk it out, or to have this type of information.
Right.
So things like that, appetite, weight changes. Often one of the key ones is that some people can experience those thoughts of suicide, you know, attempting suicide. This is very, you know, often what we think of when we think of depression, you know, based on what we've been socially ingrained with. There can be physical feelings of, you know, that you have aches or pains. These can be actual, you know, tangible ones, or they might be somatic, like psychosomatic ones, that are triggered by the depression, things like that. So any type of numbness, both physically, mentally, disinterest, anything along those lines. So, you know, a lot of what I was talking about was often what I felt when I was going through depressive episodes. You know, I experienced it a lot in high school and then in undergrad. My freshman year of undergrad was pretty bad. So having this moment of feeling like, you know, we have a lot of ideas of like, how do you break down depression? That when I was in undergrad, that I thought there was so many things going wrong, that I was in a chem program and I felt like I wasn't able to get the material. I felt worthless because I wasn't learning it. It felt like everyone else knew what they were doing. And so I remember sitting inside a lecture hall at my undergrad and sitting there in the morning and thinking it was on a second floor. And so it wasn't a very tall second floor, but it was tall enough where I thought I could walk outside right now and throw myself over that railing. And that, I remember that thought came, and that, you know, it was scary. I think people think that people with depression or suicidal thoughts, you know, are in love with that they're like, yeah, I want to be this way, or like, yeah, this is just me or like it's very sensationalized. We're like, it was scary. It's scary to have a suicidal thought, that especially of, a lot of things people would consider suicide or depressed, they don't want to be. That I didn't want to feel that way, that I didn't want to have to think that I could throw myself over on the second floor and potentially hurt myself or die. Like, that was scary. And, not everyone, unfortunately, has resources they can just run to. I was fortunate enough to have it right downstairs in that building of where the main, like, mental health resource center was. And even then, going there was scary, because it's like, I have to admit to someone that I wanted to hurt myself, that I was willing to die, but trying to like alleviate, like, I don't want to do it, but I'm scared I will. Right. I think that's that thing of people are scared to talk about it because they're worried, within reason, that some people are just going to hear that they want to hurt themselves, lock them up, and, not address the issue. That just, you can't hurt yourself, and we're not going to help you.
Saying it out loud is scary at times, too.
Yeah.
And just admitting it.
Yeah, it is. To acknowledge that, like, I could have done something. Like, I want to do something like this. Or that, I've had a history of self-harm. And that if I say this here, that people will be like, what's wrong with you? You're like, you're crazy. Like, why would you want to hurt yourself? Even when you're sad. Like, I get sad all the time. So I think something important for, like, those watching is that when people tell you that, like, I'm depressed, or like I'm feeling symptoms of depression, like I feel listless, I feel numb, take them seriously. Or like when they say, like, I thought about hurting myself, or like I thought about doing this, or recognizing ideas of self-harm, that, someone cutting themselves isn't always self-harm. Overeating can, isolating oneself can be like self-harm because you distance yourself from support. Anything like that, it's very difficult because people feel like they need to keep it under wraps because of that judgment. And I was worried about judgment. I had it from my own family. We can talk about more of like social stigma and cultural stigma more in next episode, and how these kinds of things, how people who face these things aren't listened to. So that was a common experience. I was experiencing all these things, and that reaching out was like scary because we talked about what does it mean to be vulnerable. Right. And then also be vulnerable to expose something that could, potentially, get you locked up into a unit, things like that, and not be heard. So I think, I'm talking about those symptoms, that experience I had with it, where like I could recognize it and that I knew it was happening, but I couldn't just control it. I couldn't stop the thought from coming, because there was something, that brain chemistry does play a role, as you're saying, that there's physical things going on with neurotransmitters that affect the way someone is thinking when they're going through anxiety, they're going through a depressive episode, that when people say it's all in your head, it's like, yeah, it is in your head. There is something going on inside of us that is affecting our ability to, our ability for cognition that isn't the same way that someone else would who doesn't have depression, who doesn't have anxiety, because, your levels are, aren't as balanced, and that things are affecting that you're more likely to consider jumping off that railing versus staying in the chair and just toughing through it.
Right. And so, I mean, you were talking about how there's this, the chemical imbalance, and I think we wanted to kind of go into the biological and physiological underpinnings of, anxiety. And so I thought I'd talk a little bit about what happens. Again, I'm not a scientist, but this is just something I'm very much interested in, especially because it's something I deal with every day. So what generally happens with anxiety is that the decision-making part of the brain, so our frontal cortex, if you will, which I just learned, my therapist told me, isn't fully matured until you're 25 or 26. I'm 27. I'm like, oh, that just took me by surprise. It
explains everything.
I'm like, whoa, okay. And so your frontal cortex determines the existence of a threat. And this would trigger a response in your amygdala, which is in charge of fear and aggression, which tells your hypothalamus to initiate the fight or flight response. So basically there's this whole chain. We think of like a chain of command, like someone is on the lookout and they're like, there's a bear, there's a threat, right? And then they'll call in the amygdala and they're like, yo, initiate the protocol for protecting our
body.
I don't know, weird metaphor. And then, your body sends out this defense mechanism, your fight or flight response, but as Abby mentioned, can also include freezing. And so we experience these things when we're in nature, we're camping. There's a bear. We determine that's a threat. We need to hide. We need to protect ourselves. And our muscles might prepare itself. To run, our heart rate increases. Our body is physiologically doing the things to get us to get the heck out of there. But what happens with anxiety is what happens if there's not actually the bear? What if that threat is not actually something that can harm us? What if it's just the possibility of making someone angry or a new experience or having to give a performance or a speech? Like those things aren't going to kill us, but our body reacts as if it might. And that's a struggle, right?
It's not might, it will.
It will. Like, what am I supposed to do when I recognize that too? Like, okay, this is a part of daily life and functioning, being a student. These are things that we have to do, but they're very, our bodies and brains are reacting in a way that is not really making it conducive to doing these things.
That's not as simple as like, just stop being anxious, just stop being sad. Like, I wish, like, just knock me a few
tell
times.
My body
Let me just bang my head into the wall and things will get better.
Right.
And so, kind of similar to that is that the same thing happens with depression, that, there's things going on in the brain that like are impacting the way someone is thinking through things that, the hippocampus, which is associated with memory processing, releases cortisol, which is the stress hormone. So that is obviously when that increases, your body starts to, respond to the increase in the stress hormone. And then the prefrontal cortex has been studied. So this is just research that I pulled of like that they've studied it and observed it kind of essentially like shrinking. So it shrinks in response to that excessive cortisol. That too much of it shrinks it, and the prefrontal cortex is, and the frontal lobe are responsible for like emotion management, attention, problem solving, judgment, which explains, it makes sense that as that starts to like shrink down, that you're not thinking through emotions the same way. You're not judging that I should not jump off this second floor. In that moment, it thinks this is the solution right here to stop the stress, to stop the pain, versus me just going downstairs to get help. That kind of stuff where, suddenly explains, why would someone fathom doing that? It's that, the brain has responded in a way to depression, to sadness, to events around it in a way that is meant to be protective.
Right.
But ends up being kind of like, has a double-edged sword, that too much of it has suddenly pulled us the other direction, where it feels protective to just end the pain. Versus, actually that's just going to take your life away. And that, as you said, the amygdala, that there's increased activity. So a lot of those visceral, volatile emotions like anger, sadness, fear, all gets heightened. When you're going through a depressive episode, you have decreased levels of serotonin, the happy chemical. So that goes down. Dopamine lowers as well, which is associated with things like motivation, movement, reality stuff. So this is often where like drug use can come into play, if for things like adjusting someone's reality perception, but having personal experience, so it just is a reference for that. And then also you have decreased norepinephrine, which is a neurotransmitter that kind of relates to recognizing, responding to the cortisol that's released. So it doesn't release properly, and it negatively impacts, an individual who's depressed, their ability to respond to that stress. So it kind of goes hand in hand with the cortisol and the kind of overactive, nature of what's going on in the brain at the time. So, understanding that, it suddenly makes sense that I can think, yeah, my brain is going through something. It was going through something there in my freshman year in that lecture hall. And it wasn't just me being crazy or psychotic. Like, I wasn't just like, yeah, let me do this because I don't know any better. It's like, this is what my brain is doing because it thinks this is the closest thing to making things better.
Right.
And like, even though part of my brain that I was fortunate enough to have gone through this times before, that I could think, this is not the right way. But when I first went through it, that felt like the right option, that was what to go towards. You're often hear, oh, that's the only way someone knows how to end the pain. And I think this helps give some kind of tangibility to it, for either depression or anxiety, that there's something tangible. You can't just brush this under the rug. You need to pay attention. This is something that someone can get support for. It's not just a made up thing that we're just doing for shits and giggles.
Right. And I really like that you bring that up, the tangibility. Like, first of all, thank you for sharing that very personal experience.
My voice is like,
I think
don't shake. I
think we will all agree that we are happy that you're here with. I will speak for myself. You're one of my best friends, so obviously. Okay, I'm just gonna stop.
Stop. We'll say that for off camera.
Thank you for sharing that. But yeah,
thank you for sharing yours as well. Always thank people for being vulnerable.
that tangibility, right? Because I think when we think about like, Chester Bennington, I'll keep this brief, for example, when he took his life, I'm going to admit I was angry and confused too. It's not like I knew him personally, but I was just like, people think that these celebrities who may have everything that they could ever need, how could they ever think about doing something
that he was
like
so
that?
happy before he died. How
or
could
that
he
he
done
was
that?
so selfish, right? But it's just so much more complicated, and it's not black and white, that there are other processes that maybe we're not privy to, that's not on the outside, that maybe it's in the brain, and it's a combination of everything. And so I really like talking about this aspect of mental health as a way of kind of supplementing that understanding. And I think we can go on, and I love talking about SSRIs and how they work.
We'll have time for it later.
Yeah.
Everyone who's interested in SSRIs and beta blockers, cool your jets. We'll be there soon.
And so I guess we'll talk about this a little bit later, but to kind of end the episode, I think you had a thought about, this holistic approach and why we felt it was important to bring in the science.
Yeah. I think the most important thing to take away from this episode is that we don't just have the personal experiences we talked about, but also the science behind them. That we know why you have shaky palms. We know why I was experiencing suicidal thoughts. That these aren't things we just make up. That we're pretending to do, we're pretending to experience. That there's something to be heard here. That when people bring these issues to light, that they need to be taken seriously. That there's resources here, that there's support and relief that can be given even if we're going to live with these types of things for the rest of our lives, that they don't have to be debilitating, that there's things like medications we'll talk about later that will help, address the science that we've talked about here.
Right. Yeah, so we hope you'll join us for episode 3. Hope you
enjoyed this one.
And
that you're willing to stick around for the next one.
Yay, more Abby and Melanie.
Right.
Bye.
All right, take care, everyone.